The suitcase had one broken latch, and Lin Ju Ying had been holding it shut with a length of twine for the last 400 miles. When the stagecoach rolled to a stop on the dusty main street of Lark Spur Flat, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1878, she stepped down into a town that had already decided, before she said a single word, exactly what it thought of her. The street went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a stranger walks in wearing the wrong face for the place. Zhu Ying set her suitcase down in the dirt, straightened her back, and looked at the row of faces watching her from the porch of the mercantile, the hitching post outside the saloon, the open door of the livery. She had come 2,000 miles for a job promised by letter, a position keeping books for a rancher named Everett Prescott, and she intended to keep it whether the town of Larkspur Flat liked the look of her or not. But the letter in her satchel was not the only thing waiting to complicate her arrival. Everett Prescott, it turned out, was the single most sought-after bachelor in 3 counties, a fact Zhu Ying would not learn until she was already standing in his kitchen, and by then it was far too late to simply turn around and go home. Zhu Ying was 27 years old, the daughter of a Canton merchant who had died owing money to men who did not forgive debts easily, and she had crossed an ocean and half a continent on the strength of her own arithmetic and her own nerve. She had worked the books for a shipping company in San Francisco for 3 years before the company folded, and when she saw Prescott's advertisement in a territorial newspaper seeking a literate bookkeeper for a cattle operation, no mention made of gender, she had written back the same afternoon and boarded the first stage west within the week. She had not expected the reception she got. "You're the bookkeeper," said a heavy-set woman standing outside the mercantile, arms crossed, voice pitched to carry. "Prescott's bookkeeper." "I am," Zhu Ying said. "He never said you'd be Chinese." "He never asked," Zhu Ying said, and picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the livery to ask directions to the Prescott Ranch, leaving the woman standing in the street with her mouth still slightly open. The road out to the Prescott spread ran 6 miles through grazing land gone gold and dry under the summer heat, and Zhu Ying walked it on foot because she had exactly enough money left for supper and did not intend to spend a cent of it on a wagon ride she could manage on her own 2 legs. By the time the ranch house came into view, a long, low structure of clapboard and stone with a wide porch and a corral off to one side, her feet ached and her dress was gray with dust, and she was in no mood for anything but a chair and a clear explanation of her duties. What she found instead, standing in the yard with a length of rope in his hands and a look of open surprise on his face, was Everett Prescott himself, and the surprise on his face told her everything about what he had and had not expected from the woman he'd hired sight unseen by letter. He was younger than she had pictured, sun-browned, quiet in the particular way of men who spent most of their days without company. He set the rope down slowly, wiped his hand on his trousers, and extended it toward her with none of the hesitation she had braced herself for. "Miss Lin," he said, "I confess I pictured someone older." "I confess I pictured a longer road," Zhu Ying said, and shook his offered hand, and something in his face shifted, not surprise exactly, but the particular attention of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew. "Come inside," he said. "You've walked far enough for one day." The kitchen table where he sat her down was cluttered with ledgers gone disorganized past any hope of casual sorting, columns that did not balance, receipts stuffed loose between pages instead of filed, and Zhu Ying felt something in her settle at the sight of it, the particular satisfaction of a problem she knew exactly how to solve. She had the first 3 months reorganized before supper was on the table. Supper itself was simple. Beans and cornbread, and a cut of beef that Everett cooked without much ceremony, and the 2 of them ate mostly in silence, Zhu Ying too tired from the road to make conversation, and Everett, she was beginning to understand, simply built that way, regardless of the company. It was only when she rose to clear the plates that he spoke again, watching her with an expression she could not yet read. "There's a room off the bunkhouse wing," he said. "Separate entrance, sound lock on the door. My last hired woman used it before she married off to a rancher over in the next county. It's yours if you want it." "I'll want it," Shou-Ying said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Everett said, something dry entering his voice for the first time since she'd arrived. "This is Lark Spur Flat. Half the town will have an opinion about you by breakfast tomorrow, and none of 'em will have met you yet to earn it." He was not wrong. But what neither of them yet understood was that half the unmarried women in Larkspur Flat had spent the better part of 2 years angling for exactly the position Shou-Ying now occupied. Not as bookkeeper, but as the woman who sat across Everett Prescott's kitchen table. Everett Prescott owned 4,000 acres of the best grazing land in the county, ran nearly 600 head of cattle, and had buried a wife 3 years earlier after a fever took her inside of a week, a fact the town recited to Shou-Ying within her first 2 days as though grief were public property. He had not courted anyone since, not seriously, despite what the town considered a generous and sustained campaign on the part of nearly every eligible woman for 30 miles, and his continued bachelorhood had become, over those 3 years, something close to a community project. The woman leading that project, Shou-Ying learned quickly, was a widow named Cordelia Hargrove, who owned the town's only dress shop, and had appointed herself the unofficial arbiter of who did and did not belong in Larkspur Flat society. Cordelia had a daughter of marrying age, a niece newly arrived from Ohio, and an opinion about Shou-Ying's presence at the Prescott Ranch that she did not wait long to share. "It isn't proper," Cordelia said, standing in the doorway of the Mercantile the following week, loud enough for the whole street to hear it, when Shou-Ying came into town for supplies. "A young woman living out there alone with him, bookkeeper or not." "I have my own room in the bunkhouse wing, same as any hired hand," Shou-Ying said. "And I keep his books, Mrs. Hargrove, nothing more." "Chinese girls don't keep books in this territory," Cordelia said. "They keep laundries. Everyone knows that." Shou-Ying set her basket down on the counter with a click that was louder than she intended. "I kept the books for a shipping company in San Francisco for 3 years, Mrs. Hargrove, and every column balanced to the penny. I don't know what everyone knows in this territory, but I know what I'm capable of, and that has never once required your permission." The store went very still. The clerk behind the counter suddenly found something urgent to do with a shelf of canned goods. Cordelia's face went a shade darker, but she said nothing further, and Shou-Ying paid for her flour and her thread and walked out into the street with her chin level and her pulse considerably faster than she let show. That was the moment the town of Larkspur Flat first understood that Lin Shou-Ying did not intend to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Word of the exchange reached the ranch before Shou-Ying did, carried by a freight driver who had witnessed the whole thing and repeated it to one of Everett's hands over a shared drink. And by the time she walked back up the road that evening, Everett was waiting on the porch with an expression she couldn't quite place. "Heard you had words with Cordelia Hargrove," he said. "I had facts with Cordelia Hargrove," Shou-Ying said. "She had words." Something that might have been a laugh moved through him, brief and startled, as though laughter itself was a muscle he hadn't used in some time. "She's going to make this harder on you. She's got influence in this town most folks don't argue with." "I've argued with harder people than a dress shop owner, Mr. Prescott," Shou-Ying said. "I'll manage." He studied her for a moment in the fading light, and whatever he saw settled something in his posture, some private doubt resolving itself. "I believe you will," he said, and went back inside, leaving Zhou Ying alone on the porch a moment longer than she strictly needed to be, watching the sun drop behind the western ridge and thinking, not for the first time since her arrival, that this town was going to take considerably more convincing than one afternoon in the mercantile. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Zhou Ying nor Everett had quite planned for. She worked the ledgers each morning, walked the property in the afternoons to reconcile the cattle counts against what the books claimed, and found, more often than she expected, that Everett fell into step beside her, asking questions about the numbers, listening to her answers with a patience that surprised her more than it should have. He was not a man who spoke much, but when he did, Zhou Ying noticed, he chose the words carefully, and he never once spoke to her the way half the town did, as though her accent or her origin required extra explanation before her competence could be believed. "You caught an error in the feed accounts that's been sitting there 2 years," he said one evening, standing in the barn doorway while she totaled the week's figures by lantern light. "My last bookkeeper never caught it." He crossed his arms and leaned against the door frame, watching the way her pencil moved down the column without hesitation. "Where'd you learn numbers like that?" "My father kept the books for his own trade, in Canton, before he died, owing men who did not forgive easily," Zhou Ying said, not looking up. "I learned watching him, and I learned faster once I understood the debt would fall to me if I didn't." "Your last bookkeeper wasn't looking," Zhou Ying said. "Numbers tell the truth if you're willing to actually read them." "Most people aren't," Everett said, and something in the way he said it made clear he was not entirely speaking about arithmetic. There were other visitors that summer besides the ordinary run of neighbors and freight drivers, and one of them was Everett's late wife's sister, a sharp-tongued woman named Dolores Foss, who arrived unannounced one Sunday afternoon with a basket of preserves and a great deal to say about the propriety of the household arrangement. Zhou Ying met her on the porch, offered coffee, and answered every pointed question with the same level composure she had used on Cordelia Hargrove weeks before, until Dolores finally ran out of things to needle her about and settled, grudgingly, into ordinary conversation about the ranch's finances. "You've done more for this place in 2 months than the last bookkeeper managed in 2 years, Dolores admitted, before she left, standing beside her wagon with the empty preserves basket in hand. "I'll say that plainly, whatever else I think about the arrangement." "That's all I've asked anyone to judge me on," Zhou Ying said. "The work." Dolores did not answer that directly, only nodded once, sharp and brief, and climbed up onto her wagon seat and rode off toward town, and Zhou Ying understood, watching her go, that she had won over exactly one more skeptic without needing to raise her voice to do it. The first real trouble arrived on a Sunday in July, when a fire broke out in the hay barn nearest the corral, the flames catching fast in the dry summer heat and threatening the whole structure before anyone in the main house had even noticed the smoke. Zhou Ying was the one who saw it first, out the kitchen window while she worked the morning's accounts, and she was running for the barn before she had fully decided to run, shouting for Everett and the 2 ranch hands still asleep in the bunkhouse. By the time Everett reached her, Zhou Ying had already thrown open the corral gate to drive the horses clear of the smoke, moving through the chaos with a steadiness that startled the hands who arrived seconds later, expecting to find only panic. She organized the bucket line herself, positioning the men along the shortest route from the well, directing the water where it would do the most good, rather than where instinct sent people running blind. "You've fought a fire before," Everett said, hauling a bucket past her, soot already streaking his forearms. "I've kept a shipping warehouse from burning twice," Zhou Ying said. "Fire doesn't care what language you scream at it in. It only cares whether you're organized." The barn was saved, though it cost most of the morning and left everyone soaked and blackened and exhausted, and when the last embers were finally doused, Everett stood in the wreckage of the hay stores, looking at Zhou Ying with an expression that had nothing careful left in it. "You could have let the hands handle it," he said. "You didn't have to be the one running toward the fire." "I don't wait for someone else to fix a problem I can see clearly," Shou-Ying said. "I never have." The two ranch hands, a quiet older man named Burl Ashford and a younger one named Pruitt Dell, spent the rest of that day rebuilding the section of the barn wall the fire had scorched through, and both of them, Shou-Ying noticed, had gone considerably more respectful in how they addressed her since the morning's chaos, calling her Miss Lynn now instead of the flat, careless nothing they'd used the first week she'd arrived. Burl in particular sought her out that evening, hat in hand, to say plainly that he'd misjudged her when she first came up the road, and that he wouldn't again. Pruitt, younger and quieter still, said nothing that evening, but the next morning he'd already saddled her horse before she reached the corral, a small courtesy that told her plainly enough where he now stood. "Didn't figure a bookkeeper for someone who runs toward a fire," Burl said. "Figured wrong." "Most people do, until they see it for themselves," Shou-Ying said, and the exchange settled something between them that neither needed to speak of again. But what neither of them yet knew, standing in the smoke-heavy morning air with the barn saved and the danger past, was that the fire had not started on its own, and that the truth of how it began would arrive at the ranch within the week, carried by a man neither of them had any reason to trust. The man's name was Otis Renner, a hand Everett had dismissed from the ranch 2 months prior for drinking through his wages and letting cattle wander unattended, and he arrived at the property on a Tuesday afternoon with a look on his face that told Shou-Ying, before he said a word, that his business here was not friendly. He found her alone in the yard, hanging ledgers out to dry after a rainstorm had soaked through a window left cracked the night before, and he crossed the distance between them with a swagger that made the hair on her arms rise before he even spoke. "Prescott ought to know what kind of company he's keeping," Renner said, close enough that Shou-Ying could smell the whiskey on him despite the early hour. "Chinese girl playing at bookkeeper. I hear tell that's not all you're playing at, out here alone with him." "You're trespassing on land you were dismissed from, Mr. Renner," Shou-Ying said, not stepping back, her voice level despite the cold thing settling low in her stomach. "I'd suggest you leave before Mr. Prescott finds you standing in his yard." "I set that barn fire," Renner said, low and mean, close enough now that Shou-Ying could see the particular satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure of a man who thought a threat delivered quiet was somehow less of a threat. "Figured it'd burn Prescott's confidence right along with his hay. Remind him what happens when he lets a girl like you run his affairs instead of a proper hand. Wasn't planning on it working out so clean, you all putting it out before real damage got done. Reckon I'll try again, somewhere it counts more." Shou-Ying did not scream. She did not step back. Instead, she reached calmly for the heavy iron poker leaning against the porch rail, left there that morning after someone had cleared the ash from the kitchen stove, and held it loosely at her side, not raised, not threatening, simply present, a fact in the conversation that had not existed a moment before. "You'll want to think carefully about what you say next, Mr. Renner," she said, "because I intend to repeat every word of it to the marshal in town, and arson against a working ranch is not a charge territorial law treats lightly." Something flickered across Renner's face, calculation shifting into uncertainty, and in that half-second of hesitation, Everett's voice cut across the yard from the direction of the barn, sharp and hard in a way Shou-Ying had not yet heard from him. "Get off my land, Renner, now!" Renner backed away with his hands raised in mock surrender, laughing in a way that had no humor in it, and mounted the horse he'd left tied at the gate, riding off toward town with a parting look that promised this was not finished. Everett crossed the yard fast, checking Shou-Ying over with his eyes, though he did not touch her, and something in his expression carried a fear that went well past professional concern. "He touch you?" Everett asked. "No," Shou-Ying said, "but he told me he set the fire. He means to try again, somewhere worse." Everett's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring toward the road where Renner's dust was still settling. "Then we go to the marshal together," he said finally. "Tonight." The ride into town that night carried a different weight than any errand they'd shared before, the two of them on horseback under a sky just beginning to darken, the day's heat still radiating up off the packed earth of the road. Zhou Ying kept the poker's memory close, the particular stillness she'd made herself hold while Renner stood close enough to touch her, and found that the fear she hadn't let herself feel in the moment arrived now, delayed, a fine tremor in her hands that she pressed flat against her thigh until it passed. "You went quiet," Everett said, riding close beside her, the horse's hooves steady on the packed dirt road, dusk settling gold and heavy over the fields to either side. "I'm thinking about how calm I managed to stay," Zhou Ying said. "It frightens me a little, now, how calm I was." "That's not something to be frightened of," Everett said. "That's something most men I've known would envy." She looked over at him, surprised by the plainness of it, and found him watching the road ahead rather than her, which she was coming to understand was simply how he offered the things that mattered most to him, sideways, without the weight of direct eye contact. What followed that evening was not the quiet ride into town that Zhou Ying expected to be the whole of it, but a private hour beforehand, the two of them sitting on the porch steps in the fading light, while Everett saddled the horses slower than the task required, neither of them in any particular hurry to end the conversation once it started. "I should have told him to leave the day he set foot back on this land," Everett said. "I should have seen this coming." "You couldn't have known what he intended," Zhou Ying said. "Neither could I." "That's not what I meant." Everett looked at his hands for a long moment before he looked at her. "My wife died of a fever inside a week 3 years back. I sat in that house afterward and told myself I wasn't going to let anything else matter enough to lose. Kept everyone at arm's length. Told myself it was easier that way." He paused, the silence stretching long enough that Zhou Ying did not feel it, the crickets loud in the grass and the last light gone flat and gray over the western ridge, understanding somehow that the most important thing he had to say would come after the pause, not before it. "Then you walked up my road with a broken suitcase, and balanced my books in an afternoon, and ran toward a burning barn like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I found I couldn't keep anything at arm's length anymore. That scares me more than Renner does." Zhou Ying sat very still, the porch boards cool beneath her, the evening insects starting their steady summer hum in the grass beyond the yard. "I didn't come here looking for that, Everett. I came here for honest work and a fair wage." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why it matters." She did not answer him with words. She reached over and put her hand briefly over his where it rested on the step between them, a small gesture, deliberate, and let it speak for itself the way frontier hands so often had to, before she rose and went to finish saddling her own horse for the ride into town. The marshal, a lean, careful man named Delbert Voss, listened to their account with the particular patience of someone who had heard a great many complaints in his years and learned to sort the credible from the exaggerated. He rode out to Renner's known haunts the following morning and returned with the news that Renner had already fled the county, taking whatever he could carry and leaving debts unpaid across half of Lark Spur Flat, a pattern, Voss said, that suggested a man who understood exactly how much trouble he'd invited and had no intention of standing to answer for it. "Man like that doesn't stop being trouble just because he's crossed a county line," Voss said, standing in the doorway of his small office with his hat pushed back off his forehead. "I'll wire the marshals in the neighboring territories, describe him proper, but I won't lie to either of you and tell you that guarantees anything. Best thing you can do is stay watchful." "We intend to," Everett said, and Shou Ying, standing beside him, found herself grateful for the plainness of the warning rather than any false comfort Voss might have offered instead. They rode back to the ranch in the last of the daylight, the conversation between them quieter now, settled into something that had shifted since the porch steps, and when they reached the yard, Everett walked her to the door of her room off the bunkhouse wing before saying good night, a small courtesy that had not existed between them 2 weeks before, and now felt entirely natural. But the danger did not end simply because Renner had run. It surfaced again 4 days later, and this time it was not fire that came for the ranch, but water. A summer storm broke over the county with a violence the oldest ranchers claimed they had not seen in a decade. Rain hammering down for the better part of 2 days straight, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Prescott Land, normally a modest trickle a person could step across without wetting a boot, rose fast and mean, threatening the lower pastures where nearly 200 head of cattle had been grazing when the storm broke. Shou Ying was out in it with Everett in both hands before the worst of the flooding hit, driving the herd toward higher ground through mud that sucked at every step, rain coming down so hard that shouted instructions barely carried 10 feet. It was Shou Ying who spotted the calf trapped against a fallen fence rail in the rising water, bawling in a panic that the mother could not reach past the tangled wire, and she went into the current without waiting for anyone's permission, wading in past her knees, then her waist, working the wire loose with hands gone numb from cold while the water climbed steadily toward her chest. Everett reached her seconds after she'd freed the calf, pulling both of them back toward solid ground with a grip that did not loosen until they were clear of the current entirely. And when they finally stood on the muddy bank, soaked through and shaking, the herd moving to safety around them, he held on to her a moment longer than the rescue strictly required, and neither of them pulled away first. "You don't wait for anyone," he said, breathing hard, rain running down both their faces. "Neither do you," Shou Ying said. "You were in that water before I finished calling for help." The storm passed by morning, leaving the lower pastures muddy but the herd largely intact, and in the days that followed, something in Lark Spur Flat's opinion of Lin Shou Ying began, slowly and without any single dramatic moment to mark it, to shift. Word travels fast in a small county, and the story of the fire, the flood, and the woman who had run toward both without hesitation moved from porch to porch faster than any newspaper could have carried it. Burrell and Pruitt spent the better part of a week repairing the fence line the flood had torn loose, and both men made a point, whenever a neighbor rode by asking after the ranch, of mentioning plainly that it was Shou Ying who'd gone into that current after the trapped calf without waiting on anyone's say-so. The story grew a little in the telling, as stories in small counties always do, but the core of it stayed true enough that even the most skeptical listeners found themselves reconsidering whatever they'd first assumed about the Chinese bookkeeper who had walked into town with a broken suitcase 2 months before. Cordelia Hargrove, to her credit, was among the first to say so plainly, cornering Shou Ying outside the Mercantile on a bright morning in early August with an expression considerably more careful than the one she'd worn the first time they spoke. "I said some things I shouldn't have when you first arrived," Cordelia said, not quite meeting Shou Ying's eyes. "I've heard what you did, out there in that flood. Man Renner threatened you, and you stood your ground with a fire poker instead of running for help. That's not nothing." "No," Shou Ying agreed. "It isn't." "I don't imagine you're looking for my apology." "I wasn't looking for it," Shou Ying said. "But I'll take it, Mrs. Hargrove, since you've offered it." Something that might have been the beginning of respect passed between them, brief and unpolished, and Cordelia gave a short nod before returning to her shop, and though the two women would never be close, the sharpest edge of the town's judgment had visibly begun to dull. 3 months passed before the county fully settled into its new understanding of things. The summer heat finally breaking into the first cool evenings of autumn. The Prescott Ranch running smoother than it had in the 3 years since Everett's wife had died. The ledgers balanced to the penny every single week. The herd fully recovered from the flood and grazing fat on the recovering pastures. Everett Prescott and Lynn Shou Ying were married in a small ceremony on the ranch porch in late September, attended by a modest gathering that included, somewhat to everyone's surprise, Cordelia Hargrove, who brought a wedding gift and stayed for the entire supper afterward without a single unkind word. Dolores Foss came too, sitting near the front with an expression that had softened considerably since her first skeptical visit, and Burl and Pruitt stood at the back in their cleanest shirts, grinning the way men do when something they doubted turns out right in the end. The marshal, Delbert Voss, rode out for the occasion as well, remarking to Everett over supper that Larkspur Flat had not seen a wedding draw so wide a crowd from so many corners of the county in years, a fact that said more about how far Shou Ying's reputation had traveled than any single conversation could have. The marriage was not the talk of Larkspur Flat because of scandal anymore, but because of the plain fact that the Prescott Ranch had become, under 2 sets of steady hands instead of 1, the most productive operation in the county, its books cleaner and its herd healthier than any spread for 30 miles. The mercantile owner had taken to referring customers with tangled accounts to Shou Ying for advice, and 2 other ranching families in the valley had hired bookkeepers of their own that autumn, following, they admitted plainly, the example the Prescott spread had set. Shou Ying kept the ledgers still every morning, the same careful discipline that had carried her 2,000 miles from a shipping office in San Francisco to a ranch kitchen in Wyoming Territory, and Everett often found himself, in the quiet hours after supper, simply watching her work the columns by lamplight, still faintly amazed, 3 months into their marriage, at the particular kind of courage it had taken for a woman with a broken suitcase to walk into a town that had already decided what it thought of her, and prove every single one of them wrong. Cordelia Hargrove's dress shop that autumn began carrying a small shelf of imported silk thread that Shou Ying had suggested she order, a modest business arrangement between 2 women who would never call each other close friends, but had settled, over the months, into something steadier than politeness, a working respect neither had expected the summer before. Dolores Foss wrote a letter that October, the first Shou Ying had received from her late husband's family since the wedding, offering nothing more than a recipe for winter preserves and a line at the bottom noting that her brother had chosen well, brief and unadorned in exactly the way Shou Ying had come to expect from the woman. Burl and Pruitt stayed on through the autumn roundup, both of them considerably more talkative around Shou Ying now than they'd been in July, and it was Burl, mending a section of corral fence one October afternoon, who told her plainly that the ranch felt different since she'd arrived, steadier, like a wagon that had finally gotten its wheels aligned proper after years of pulling crooked. "Wasn't broken before," Burl said, "but it wasn't running true either. Runs true now." "That's the nicest thing anyone in this county has said to me," Shou Ying said, and meant it. The suitcase itself sat now in the corner of their bedroom, the broken latch finally mended, no longer a thing she needed to hold shut with twine, and Shou Ying kept it there deliberately, a reminder of exactly how far she had come and exactly what she had been willing to risk to get there. She thought sometimes, watching the lamplight catch the mended leather, of the woman who had stepped down off that stagecoach into a street gone silent with judgment, and found she felt no anger toward that memory any more, only a kind of quiet gratitude that she had refused, that first afternoon, to make herself smaller for a town that had not yet earned the right to an opinion about her. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.